My name is Jonah Jonathan, and welcome once again to the Jazz Musician's Voice. I'm doing an interview today with really one of the top educators in this music, Scott Reeves. He's a wonderful player, and he's also a composer and arranger, and he leads the Scott Reeves Jazz Orchestra. I'm really pleased to sit down with him and talk about a wide variety of issues. Really one of the cats to check out. Has performed all over the world and is widely respected as a musician. So thanks for watching this interview. Please subscribe, hit the like, share it with your friends. Stay tuned because we have a lot more future interviews coming. So, ladies and gentlemen, today I'm really pleased to speak with one of the top educators and minds in this music of jazz, Scott Reeves. He's taught for many years at many different universities, also amazing composer and arranger and director of big band jazz. I have a connection with Scott through his wife, Janet Reeves, who was a wonderful piano teacher at William Patterson University. I learned a lot about jazz piano from her. And, you know, the two of you guys are very nice people and talented musicians. So thanks for speaking with me today, Scott.
Oh, my pleasure, John.
So let's talk about your early background. We'll talk about where you are from originally and how you became involved in music and jazz.
Okay. Well, I grew up in the Chicago area, and in fact, the same suburb of Chicago that Hillary Clinton grew up in. She was in high school with my older sister, actually. And then I went to Indiana University primarily to study with David Baker, the great jazz educator. And he was a profound influence on me and really introduced me to what jazz was all about. And in high school, I discovered jazz and just became maniacal about it, you know, and started with Count Basie, actually, and then I got into Bird and Diz, and then Miles and Train, and I actually had the experience in high school of sitting in my room and listening to Miles' ESP, and it just so transported me that I decided this is what I want to do with my life. I want to figure out what these guys are doing. So
yeah,
that was an experience.
You know, especially in my time studying with Ron Carter, I was really focusing in on that group, and that whole all those records take you to a whole different world. It's so still today so relevant and so modern, you know.
Yeah, it almost just seemed like this unbelievable mystical world or something. You know, we were talking earlier about astronomy, and one of the things I love about going out in the country and looking through my telescopes at galaxies is it gives me the sense of the mystery of the universe. And in a way, listening to Miles from that period had a similar effect on me.
You know, I think Ron had this term, you know, that they were just scientists in a laboratory. It's like pushing the limits of what they could do with the music. And
absolutely.
Yeah, you know, that stuff is just, you cannot top Miles Davis, you know, second grade quintet in the 60s,
right.
You know?
Yeah. And Miles always told them just to experiment and play something they've never played before, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think if I recall the story correctly, he invited all of them into his basement for a rehearsal, and Miles was not there. They didn't know where he was, and he was listening on the intercom while they were starting to get together. That's just that stuff. I have not heard any group come anywhere remotely close to the whole lockup of that group. And you're absolutely right. And that is one of the things that attracted me to this music is the ethereal, mysterious sense of the music. I mean, I remember hearing Kind of Blue as a child
Mm-hmm.
You know, So What, and that intro and the modal sounds, like that's the stuff that gets a lot of us into this music, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, David Baker, quite a well-known educator. I've read some of his books, and so
He
talk
was
about
a great trombonist too, and was a big help in learning to play jazz trombone.
So you went to Indiana University. Talk about like David Baker and some of the other guys you studied with at the school, and how that influenced you.
Well, as I said, David Baker was a big influence on me learning what the nuts and bolts of jazz were. He was almost like a scientist in the way he approached it. And also, later on in my career, I just retired after 40 years of college teaching. I realized what a big influence he was on me as a teacher as well, not just in developing my music. But I also had some very good trombone teachers there. Indiana had a good endowment, and they often hired people away from the New York Philharmonic and the Philadelphia Symphony. So I had really good classical trombone training. And even though that's not what I wanted to do at the time, I still feel like my playing is getting better and growing even at my age. And I owe it all to having good fundamental instruction in technique and air and embouchure and all of that. So I got a lot out of it. Some of the other people that were there at the time, Michael Brecker was there, and he was in the middle of dropping out of school. In fact, I used to walk around with a little reel-to-reel tape recorder. This really dates me. And Michael Brecker did a trio concert in the basement of a church in Bloomington, Indiana. And he must have been, 18, 19 years old. And he just played with bass and drums solid for about 2 hours. And I taped it onto reel-to-reel. I've now digitized it. I'll send you a copy.
That's incredible. Yeah,
it's a remarkable document, because he didn't really sound like kind of like the Michael Brecker we know, but he was really channeling John Coltrane and Sonny Rollins in particular. And there's some tunes that he sounds so much like Rollins, and then he does a Coltrane medley where he really sounds like Train. And I spoke to him briefly. He ended up dropping out of school and moving to New York to join Dreams and work with his brother Randy. But I said, what are you trying to do? And he said, well, I'm kind of trying to combine John Coltrane with King Curtis. So you can tell he was trying to bring in the R&B feel to that.
Yeah. I mean, Michael Brecker, I remember actually, I was just starting William Patterson when he had passed, and everybody was talking about him, and I hadn't quite checked him out yet. But now it's like there's all these videos on YouTube of like times when Michael Brecker went into beast mode, and he's just an incredible soloist, and went through all of that. So many great musicians that have since passed. He was certainly one of them,
Yeah. Oh, and another person that might be of interest to you that was a classmate of mine was John Clayton. Actually, that may have been during my master's work there, because he's a little bit younger than me. And I got to do some gigs with John Clayton too, and it was a lot of fun. And he was always talking about, well, if Ray Brown saw me playing in this kind of venue, he'd kick my butt,
He's a really nice guy. He came to William Patterson and did like a workshop. I remember talking with him, and his son is talented too, Gerald.
That's right. Wow. Yeah, he's had his own path going.
Yeah, and
Peter Erskine was there at that time. Harry Hay, who went out to L.A. and did all that work for Quincy Jones and stuff. So there were some great musicians that, I was fortunate to be in an environment where I got my butt kicked regularly, and it helped me grow. And good learning.
That's you touch on the good point about getting your butt kicked, because nowadays we have so many of these young musicians who don't get their butt kicked. And I think that was something I always remember about this music. Man, having a lesson with Ron or having a lesson with Rufus Reed. These guys don't mince words, and they tell you like it is, or even Mulgrew Miller, you know, and that is so important in development, you know, and you've got to have a little bit of a thick skin to learn that they're coming from a place of love to get you to a better place. But now I found talking with a lot of guys, like educators, are like, they're worried they're going to get fired just for saying the wrong thing to these kids, you know, or they're worried about, their career and the grades and stuff, like, yeah, that's certainly a thing, you know.
You mentioned Rufus Reed. I feel like I've gotten a lot closer to him since I moved to New York, because he and I were in the BMI Jazz Composers Workshop. I'm sure we'll probably get to my work as a big band writer, but we were in the class together. And here he was, you know, a monster in the field, you know, and yet he came into the class to be able to study with Mike Abene and Jim McNeely, and he's an incredible writer, you know. I really admired his writing, and such a sweet guy.
Very nice guy, you know. We did an interview at his house before coronavirus, fortunately, last summer. I was there at his house, and he's got like a studio on the back, and we had a great conversation. But many years before that, when I was a 16-year-old, I managed to get like a 3-hour lesson with him, where he instilled a lot of important points. And, you know, he's got that video out there, The Evolving Bassist, which talks all about like really important stuff. And nowadays people watch it because Mulgrew Miller was playing on piano and Louis Nash on drums. And that was just the lockup of that was amazing, you know. But when you talk about trombone, let's get into that a little bit, because believe it or not, my father was a trombone player. He's from the Sudan, so he did play trombone in high school and stuff. He since has not played it, but I know a little bit about trombone, and you've got to have, like, you've really got to build up your embouchure and talk a little bit about the trombone, and for young trombonists who are watching, some tips or pointers, you know.
Well, I guess the biggest tip I could give is practice every day. And also, I think I understand how to teach trombone, because when I was young, I did everything wrong, and I had to relearn proper technique. And as I mentioned, my teachers at Indiana University put me on the right track of straightening out my embouchure. And most of really what the embouchure is, although you have to have control of firm muscles around here and a flat shin, but most of the work is done with the air. And I've gotten ridiculed at rehearsals and stuff like that, where I come in and people see me blowing air for a long time. What are you doing? You trying to get high over there or something? But every day I start off with, and I have certain tubes and things I blow through just to open up my lungs, you know, which also has a side effect of kind of opening up my brain, to oxygenating my brain. But if I pick up the horn without having done any breathing, my throat will tighten up. So I really get my lungs working. They're the bellows that power the whole thing. The rest of it is just kind of keeping your lips from moving around and letting them flap, and moving your arm or fingers in the right place. You know, most of the work is done with the air.
Yeah. Well, you know, certainly shows in your playing. I mean, you're quite a talented guy. You've played with so many musicians. I mean, we will certainly get into college career and teaching, but you know, I just want to mention this quickly. I mean, you have studied with so many of the well-known masters of improvisation, like Kenny Werner, Jim McNeely, David Baker, Woody Shaw. I mean, just those names alone say something about your credentials as a composer and arranger. What would be like a few serious tidbits that you have learned from these masters about composing and arranging?
Well, some of them were more about playing than writing, but yeah, that's a great question. I'll give a little dab of each one. Of course, with David, I learned more about, in hindsight, more theoretical kinds of things and how to develop vocabulary on the instrument, how to practice, that sort of thing. And then maybe I'll mix this in a little bit with the historical background. When my wife and I actually met when we were undergraduates in Indiana University. We got married while we were still in school, and I thought, well, what do we do now? And we ended up moving out to the West Coast, the Bay Area. And we didn't stay there very long, but during that time, Woody Shaw was living in San Francisco. I think what he was doing, actually, he was taking a break to get away from New York because he had kind of been involved in some non-healthy scenes in New York, and he thought if he went to San Francisco, maybe he could chill a bit. So I managed to get it was really only 2 lessons, but I still have the stuff he wrote out for me. I'd never met him, but particularly the record that he did with Elvin Jones and Joe Henderson. I guess it's under Elvin's name, Unity. Oh, no, it's under Larry Young's name, Unity. That was after the ESP period of Miles. That was sort of, I was moving into listening to a lot of Wayne and Woody and Joe Henderson and of course Train, of course. And that record, Unity, was one of my Desert Island records. And I just felt like, wow, how could I learn to play like Woody Shaw down an octave, you know, on the trombone? So I had an opportunity to take some lessons with him, and I hadn't met him, so I didn't know what to expect. In fact, I was actually really scared of being in his presence, you know. And he was like a scholar. He kind of wrote down all these things for me to practice and explain them. And, you know, he sort of went into his college professor mode or something like that. And I still occasionally work on some of those things and try and integrate them into my playing. Most of them were about the use of pentatonic scales and fourths, and he had me learn an Eric Dolphy tune, Miss Anne, which actually I just revisited and did a new arrangement of Miss Anne. And he also told me some interesting things, like he got a little bored with making chord changes on standard tunes sometimes because he could do it so well. And so he said sometimes what he would do is he would start like at the beginning of the phrase inside the chord and then use fourths and pentatonics to go anywhere. And he said, you know, it'll all work if you make the 5-1 at the end of the phrase. So that made a big impression on me too. And I tried that. It gave me the freedom. I mean, David Baker taught me how to make chord changes, but I got kind of stuck in that, like feeling like I had to make every chord change. But what Woody taught me to do was, well, hear them, but don't necessarily outline them all and just make it convincing at the end so it sounds like you weren't lost or something like that. Then I started teaching. My first teaching job was at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington, which is north of Seattle, and I played with some wonderful players in the Seattle area. But we had Lee Konitz in for a workshop, and so I cornered him and asked for a private lesson. This was a real interesting story too, because he said, okay, play something for me. So I've been working on Confirmation. I played Confirmation. I started soloing on it. And at that time, most of my practice was the Charlie Parker Omni book. I worked my way through the Charlie Parker Omni book 2 or 3 times, trying to learn the bebop vocabulary. And so I was playing all these kind of bird-like licks that I had worked out and memorized and practiced in 12 keys. And he stopped me in my second course. He says, whoa, you're in your second course where you should be in your 10th course. I said, well, what do you mean? And what he had me do is he said, I just want you to play the melody over and over and over again. But each time you play it, maybe introduce a few melodic variations that seem to come naturally. And I did that a while, just kind of paraphrasing confirmation. And in my 10th course, it sounded like I was improvising a solo again, you know? So I guess what I learned from that was basically don't forget about the melody, you know, because I was so totally into chord changes at that point in time.
Yeah. I mean, such a great musician as well, Lee Konis, and man, it really shows in your playing. And I mean, you're actually kind of at the forefront of college education because, you know, you've been teaching, like you said, you just recently retired from teaching at City College, but you're teaching for over 40 years. And, you know, having spoken with many great educators like Andy Jaffe, for example, I mean, you're one of the first when college education was starting to when it is now. And like you mentioned, you know, University of Southern Maine, Virginia Commonwealth University, Memphis State University, Western Washington University, City College, Juilliard. I mean, it really seems like
on me.
Yeah, it seems like teaching is your calling. I mean, you know, you're established educator. So let's talk a little bit about that. Like, how do you feel college teaching and education has changed since you started, from when you started to now? Because I'm sure there's a lot of changes, you know. It must have been new when you were starting still, you know?
Yeah, fairly new. I'm really kind of more like the second wave. David Baker and Jerry Coker were really the first wave, but I was right there in the next wave. I never set out to be a college teacher, interestingly enough. I just wanted to be a player and a writer. But I found when I got out of school, and this is, I think, an important lesson that I learned, is that one thing that going to college can do for you is teach you how to be your own teacher. And I'm always examining my own playing, sometimes unmercifully so. I'm my own worst critic. In much the way that, you know, I might look at a student trying to figure out, okay, well, what's the problem with their playing? How can I help this person change their approach? I do that to myself. When I first got out of school, I kind of felt like I needed to organize what I was practicing, and I started writing things down that I found helpful, or things I wanted to practice in 12 keys, or solos I had transcribed. And eventually those became a book, which was published by Prentice Hall, called Creative Jazz Improvisation. We can talk more about that if you want, but I still want to get back to your question about how it's changed. You know, I don't know that it has changed that much in terms of what people are teaching. It's just the amount. Now, almost every school has a jazz program. You know, there were only a handful when I started. Indiana and North Texas State and Eastman, and of course Berkeley, that was about it if you wanted to study jazz. And now every good music school of any size has at least some sort of jazz program. And there's certainly a lot more talented students, which in a way it's almost like there are so many, especially in New York, as you know, so many good players, young players I've never even heard of, and I go hear them and wow, they're phenomenal. So jazz education in some ways may be a victim of its own success, and that there's probably more very talented players out there than even pre-pandemic the marketplace could support, you know. And that kind of takes me back to how I got started, you know, just trying to make a living as a giggy musician, as I'm sure you know, and probably everyone who ends up watching this, not an easy thing. You basically, unless you're one of the anointed ones that gets a gig at that very sliver at the top, like making the NBA of music or something, you're going to do a combination of either commercial gigs or you're going to be involved in teaching. And I did my share of both of those things. But I guess I would rather teach to serious-minded students than I would maybe do gigs where I have to play music I can't stand. So yeah. I found it to be a very natural thing for me, because I think my brain kind of works that way, and that I'm like looking at things and kind of organizing my thoughts. And every time I learned something new, I would get really excited about it and feel like telling someone else. You know, I have a friend who's an amateur musician in Chicago, and I would always call him up, "Hey man, I just transcribed this Rollins thing, and he does this thing here. Oh, this is really," you know. And then I realized I really enjoy talking about it. And of course, I was lucky in that my 40 years of teaching was all at the collegiate level. I don't know how I would have reacted if I was teaching at the public school level. I think that's a harder row to hoe.
Yeah,
but, yeah. The vast majority of my students are people who wanted to be players themselves. So for me to get paid to go into a classroom and talk about a love supreme, I mean, it's kind of a dream gig in some ways, you know?
Absolutely. I mean, like, I totally understand what you're talking about. Like, I have a hard time, like, wanting to teach in, like, a high school or, like, middle school setting. I mean, I found actually some of the younger students are fun to work with, but when you get to a certain age, it's just like some of these kids don't even really want to be playing music, and that can be tricky. And then, you know, I do find in college, like in the collegiate program, I remember this fact from Mulgrew Miller, and I think he was absolutely correct. He was like, 1 in 1,000 of you students will probably make a living somewhere close to what I'm making, you know? And so then I thought about it, and I did some introspection, and I end up finding that in many cases, some of these teachers are fulfilling the prophecy. They couldn't make it, so they're teaching in the program, and in that case, it gets more students for the program. And then eventually what happens is there's too many students, there's not enough gigs, and we're starting to see the fruition of that, especially in coronavirus times. We are seeing these musicians playing on the streets in raggedy clothes, basically begging for money. And, you know, they've paid so much money to learn their craft to that level. It becomes unfortunate, but I hope that through discussion and the proper channels, there will be new solutions to continue this art form, because it's one of America's great treasures, you know.
Absolutely, I'm right with you on that.
Yeah, but you know, when you talked about the books, yes, your books are like some of the classic texts in jazz. I mean, you mentioned creative improvisation. And then there's another one, Creative Beginnings. So talk a little bit about that and those books and how you wrote them and how they're used now. And
well, it really goes back to my very first teaching job at Western Washington University. I was faced with having to teach 4 levels of jazz improvisation. I'd never done that before. I had taught a course at a musicians union prior to getting my first job at a university, so I kind of knew what I was doing, but I basically sat down and wrote out worksheets for all my students, kind of like Janet did for her classes. And eventually these worksheets became a pile like this, and I thought, I think maybe there's a book here. And one thing I tried to make sure is that everything in there was useful to a player. And it's stuff I practiced myself. I'm not saying it's stuff I mastered. If I mastered everything in my book, I'd probably be a legendary player by now. But I worked on it all, and if I saw it had some benefit to my musical growth, I kept it in. If it didn't, they took it out. Because there's a lot of books out there that are just like, okay, you take these 4 notes, and here's the 8,000 ways you can play those 4 notes, and 7,999 of them don't sound that good, you know. So why, if you're going to like particularly learn some vocabulary, and we can talk about the whole scale pattern practice thing too if you want to, but sometimes I think that's a necessary way of getting started. Unless your ears are already deep into the music, it can bring the sound of the music into your ear to do that. But why not take a Charlie Parker lick or a Clifford Brown lick and work on that in 12 keys? That way you're really hearing the vocabulary that great players use, instead of like, oh, here's all the possible ways you can play the scale, you know. So I tried to make it musical. And I also realized that while practicing certain things on your instrument is one thing, you kind of got to know what you're doing. So there maybe needs to be a brief but not overly dense explanation of theory. And then a lot of people learn entirely or at least partially by transcribing solos. That's one of the major things. So that's important too, transcriptions. And then learning repertoire is a big thing, just knowing the tunes, you know. And I mean, learning a Charlie Parker tune is like almost like transcribing his solo, because his tunes are like his solos. So you're learning the vocabulary. So when I started to teach, I wanted to teach all of those 4 aspects, but I could not find any book that had all of them. You could get pattern books, you could get transcribed solo books, you could get theory books. I wanted it all together, you know, sort of a user-friendly way. And that's, I think, what was unique about my book. It did become a bestseller, so to speak, in the college jazz curriculum. And then Prentice Hall discontinued it because they went all digital in 2018. I now have the rights restored to me, and I'm negotiating with Routledge Press. So I'm hoping that next year you'll see a new version of that book come out.
That would be great. You know, yeah, those books are important. Like, I've got a bookshelf of all these different books. Like, you know, I personally like jazz theory and jazz harmony. It's a challenging topic, but, you know, like, for example, Andy Jaffe's book, I've got his books, which are still trying to get through it, you know, understand some of the topics, because, I mean, it's some of the most complex music, you know, and even classical musicians, they're basically just playing the notes on the paper. They don't understand these theoretical concepts that jazz musicians basically have to improvise these things on the spot, you know. So there's a lot of things to be said about jazz pedagogy, you know.
Right.
But talking about you as a player, I mean, big band jazz really seems like one of your fortes. I mean, you've traveled the country and the world developing and performing this music. You know, you perform with the Dave Liebman Big Band, the Bill Mobley Band, Erica Seguin Orchestra, you know, your Scott Reeves Jazz Orchestra, you subbed for the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra, you know, Afro-Cuban Orchestra, Chico Farrell, and so talk about your love of big band music and, you know, how you became involved in that, and then you can talk about how you started your Scott Reeves Jazz Orchestra.
Okay. I always wrote ever since I was in high school. As soon as I got into playing, before I even knew what I was doing, I tried writing things down. And when I studied with David Baker, he gave me the basic rules about how to score for instruments and ranges and transpositions and some basics about voicings and that kind of thing. And then I went through periods where I didn't do it quite as much. But when I came to New York, which was in 1999, when I got the job at City College of New York, I'd done a lot of writing for like octets and that kind of thing, and a few things for big band. But and I'd always played with big bands ever since I was in high school. We had a big band at the high school. But I decided I wanted to deepen my craft of writing. And as I mentioned earlier, BMI had this program, which was free of charge, to work on it. It was like a master's level class in arranging. It wasn't even really a class. It was more of a forum. And at the time, Bob Brookmeyer had started that, but unfortunately, by the time I got here, he had already moved on. So unfortunately, I never had the chance to study with Bob Brookmeyer, who I feel Bob Brookmeyer and Thad Jones and Jim McNeely are probably the biggest influences on my writing style from different directions. But, you know, I grew up listening to Basie too. But I enjoyed, had the opportunity to join the BMI class, and I did it for 8 years when I first moved here. And that's when Rufus and I were in the same class together, along with a lot of other really fine writers. And basically, you'd bring in a part of a score every week, and they would look at it and make comments. And then I think every other month there would be a rehearsal band at the Musicians Union. That, even if you only had 8 bars, they'd play that 8 bars, and then you could say, okay, now try it with trumpets and cup mutes, so you could hear what that was like. And then I was in a band, after I finished that, I was in a band in West Orange that played every week, and it gave me a laboratory at a club called Cecil's. I don't know if you...
Yeah, Cecil's is a great club, yeah.
Yeah.
Fortunately closed.
House big band for that. And it gave me a chance to bring in all these things I was writing and try things out, and sometimes just bring in a half a chart and they'd play it because, you know, sometimes there wasn't a lot of audience there, so we could try things. And that kicked it up another notch. And then I went, the first time around it was Mike Abene and Jim McNeely and I'm leaving out an important name, Manny Albam. Then I decided, you know, I want to do this again. And I went back for another 2-3 year stints. And at that time, it was Jim McNeely and Mike Holober, who's my colleague at City College, both great writers. And at that point, I feel like my writing went up to a much higher level. And there was a venue in Brooklyn at that time called the Tea Lounge. I don't know if you ever played there or not, but
maybe. I'm not sure. So many venues, you know.
Big space, you know, so big enough for big bands. And I started assembling a band kind of informally at first, and just to try out my compositions. And I did that. I think I started that in 2008. And that band has kind of stayed together with virtually the same personnel since 2008. So in 2016, I decided it's time to record it. I've done a few recordings in my life, but I don't feel like doing them often unless I have really something that I consider unique to say. You know, I know a lot of people, oh, I got to do 1 or 2 a year, and I listen to them and they, well, that was kind of like the last one, you know. I wait until I feel I have something really that I want to get out there. And I felt the time had come 8 years later, after this band had been together, to put out my first big band record, Portraits and Places. And then we didn't get it all recorded at that session, and I had more tunes. So 2 years later, we came out with the second one, Without a Trace. And I'm continuing in that path now. During the pandemic, I finished 2 new ones. So I'm seeing down the horizon a third Scott Reeves Jazz Orchestra record. Luckily, the tea lounge closed down, and it actually morphed into a place called Sir D's, which I ended up curating, and then that closed down. And then I managed to get my band in the regular rotation at Birdland. We were supposed to play there a couple of weeks ago, actually, but obviously during the pandemic. So I'm hoping that Birdland will survive this and we'll be able to go back in there again.
Well, I've checked out some of the music. It's really incredible, and you have some really of the top musicians on it, listening, you have you have Carolyn Lenhart singing, and you have, what's his name, Steve Wilson, and you have so many great established musicians, and the music is really creative. So, congratulations on those projects,
Yeah, I go way back with Steve Wilson. He was actually a student there when I taught at Virginia Commonwealth University. And Ellis Marcellus was on the faculty at that time too, Winton's father. And so Steve and I stayed in touch over the years. And then when we had an opening at City College, I guess I can legally say that I was just strongly pitching Steve Wilson for that position, and was delighted that he got hired there. And then he became a colleague of mine. And, Steve plays all over the world with players at such a high level. I felt really fortunate. He not only played lead alto in my big band, I never expected him to say yes. I was busy, The only time he subbed out was when Christian McBride would call him out. Yeah, Christian calls him out. Don't worry about it, man. So.
Yeah, incredible musician. When Mulgrew Miller passed, he was nice enough. He invited me to play in the Dizzy's Club celebration. Mm-hmm. Played with him, and played with Cyrus Chestnut and Louis Nash, and
wow,
man, that was incredible. He's a talented musician. Mm-hmm. And Steve Nelson, those guys are all legends in their own right. But I wanted to talk about another topic. We were discussing this before the interview, but you have other hobbies that you're into. I saw you do biking, and your wife Janet mentioned you're really into astronomy, and I see that you talk about that. And you and your wife have a talented son who's a drummer, mm-hmm. putting out stuff. So talk about the other aspects to life and how you manage to balance that being a musician,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, unfortunately, everyone in my immediate family is a musician. I married a very talented woman, and as you well know, and we just have one child. And when he was like 2, sitting in his car seat, and he would rock in rhythm, and sometimes we'd have music on playing in the car, and we noticed that he was like, before he could even speak, he was verbalizing in polyrhythms. And my father thought there was something wrong with him. But Janet and I, being both musicians, thought, this kid's got a great sense of time. So we not only agreed to let him take up drums in school, but we actually encouraged him. And he's like kind of a natural drummer. He cannot sit still without drumming on something. And he's married now, and his wife has had to learn to put up with him drumming on the tabletops and drumming on the furniture. It's like and the videos he sends me of him playing and gets 5 against 7, it's like, I can't even hear that. How do you hear this stuff? So it's been great to have music be a common denominator in the family. But you were talking about my other hobbies. We talked before the interview about my love of astronomy as well as yours. So we share that in common. And I found other musicians out there too. A lot of amateur astronomers tend to be engineering geeks or opticians or something like that. But there's a core of jazz musicians who are into it too. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, that it has that same sense of wonder that maybe listening to great jazz can bring. Plus, it appeals to my sort of scientific side. And now that I'm building telescopes, it's nice to work with my hands, because after years of working primarily with my brain, it's nice to get in and hammer something and see a telescope at the end of the end result. And I have recently developed with the astronomy club, I'm in an observing site up in the Catskills, and we've leased some land up there, because to really do, now you were talking about seeing Jupiter and Saturn, that you can do from the city with a decent telescope, because they're so close to us that the light is bright. It's in our own solar system. But the things I often look at are distant galaxies, and those will get washed out by city lights. So you have to drive about 100 miles. Even Burlington is too light polluted, but you only have to go about maybe 40 miles from Burlington to get dark skies. You have to go about 100, 120 miles to get a dark sky. So I go up to the Catskills with my telescope at least twice a month, and if the skies are clear and there's no moon in the sky, and it's very fulfilling, and particularly during the pandemic. I mean, the only thing that's kind of keeping me going right now, is, other than sitting home writing new big band arrangements, is outdoor socially distanced jam sessions, and going up to the Catskills to have outdoor socially distanced star parties.
It's really quite a fun thing, and I remember the first time I got a chance to look at the sun and see the sunspots. Mm-hmm. I had a solar filter put on, and wow, it's just incredible to see that. And then I remember reading that the Chinese used to actually look at it without any telescope to see how many spots there were, and they would know if it was going to be cold because of like a little small ice age, because they would look at how many. Obviously, they went blind, some of them, but
I think Galileo lost some of his vision by doing that too. But back then too, when they were doing that, the telescopes were so small and so primitive that they could maybe kind of get by with it a little bit without too much. Now, any modern telescope, you'd be like blinded immediately. So anybody watching this, do not do that without a certified solar filter.
You need a solar filter for sure, but you
can see planets. You can see planets from your backyard. Mars is great right now. You can actually see markings and polar caps on Mars.
It's an incredible thing, especially it puts everything in perspective when you can look and see galaxies or planets out there, and you see it physically with your eye in a telescope. You're like, oh wow, that's what they were talking about. Because you just see it in a picture, it's like it doesn't really have that. You've got to figure out how to find it, turn the telescope just to the right angle. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, there are amateur astronomers who are, in fact, kind of saving our future, maybe, because they are finding asteroids that might hit our planet.
Absolutely. There's a lot of stuff out there. I saw one not too long ago streak through the sky. It looked green, this big shower of green, and I'm glad that one didn't hit.
And I even remember, this very clearly. I was in graduate school in Lewis Porter's class, and he lets us have our computers open. And I remember getting the notification about the meteor in Russia. Mm-hmm. And like I said something, and we all just like gather around my computer, and there's this big meteorite. We're like, wow, but
you had it come down over Manhattan instead of a small town in Siberia. There could have been a lot of issues.
Yeah, a lot of windows broken and sound. But yeah, that's something that we all are faced with, and obviously we all know what happened to the dinosaurs, the latest theory.
And the other nice thing about astronomy too is it makes us see, kind of puts us in our place. all think we're the best. I'm the best, and my group is the best, and our country's the best. But it's a big universe out there, and we're just a little small part of it. And we're all in this together, and we all have to do our best to come together and save this planet. Because everything is finite, including the fate of our planet and our sun and solar system and all of that. And to be squabbling over little details, that's moving us in the wrong direction.
Absolutely. That stuff is out there. Like, we will see what happens. I'm just so tired of the coronavirus, just as anyone else is. Like, if people had just followed the rules like they do here in Vermont and wear a mask, I think we would have had less issues. Because we look at other countries, look at New Zealand or Australia, and they've got, like, the whole time that this has happened, they've had 5 deaths.
Right.
Think of the state of Vermont, maybe like 60 deaths, but you go looking at the whole United States, over 250,000 now. So,
well, without turning this music interview political, but it all starts at the top,
Yeah. I mean,
lead by example.
Lead by example. That's correct. But, Scott, thanks so much for speaking with us.
Oh, Jonathan, the pleasure was mine. And it's so great. I don't know I can't remember if we've met, but I felt.
I think we probably have, at William Patterson,
I think I came to a recital there. Yeah.
Yeah.